For a long moment the arena remained perfectly silent, as if the entire chamber had forgotten how to breathe. Ethan Cole stood 10 feet from Queen Lysara, the dim internal lights of his armor reflecting faintly across the polished black floor. Inside the helmet his heartbeat sounded steady in his ears, a slow and familiar rhythm that had carried him through long patrols and quiet nights under alien skies. The Queen's request still hung in the air between them. Remove your armor and prove what you truly are. Ethan lifted his head slightly, the cracked visor catching the light from the towering columns above. Through the fracture, he could see the Queen clearly now. Her posture remained calm, but her eyes held a sharp curiosity that reminded him of scientists he had met during joint Terran expeditions. They had looked at strange minerals and new stars the same way she was now looking at him. Not with anger, with questions. Around them, the Velari audience shifted in their seats carved into the arena walls. Their voices were quiet, but the translation field carried fragments of speculation through Ethan's helmet speakers. Some believed the human armor must contain hidden machinery. Others suggested a symbiotic organism beneath the plating. A few whispered about experimental Terran biology designed for war. Ethan almost smiled at that one. The Queen folded her hands calmly behind her back. The movement was subtle, but it carried the quiet authority of someone accustomed to commanding entire fleets without raising her voice. You hesitate, she said. Her tone was not hostile. It sounded more like an observation. Ethan slowly flexed his fingers inside the armored gloves. The joints hummed softly as the servos responded. The suit had been designed to help humans operate in environments that could freeze steel or melt rock. It could filter poison from the air and lift weights that no unassisted human body could manage. But beneath the technology, there was still just a human being. He exhaled slowly. Your Majesty, he said through the external speaker. His voice came out slightly rough from hours of recycled oxygen. You asked for proof. Queen Lysara nodded once. Correct. Ethan tilted his helmet toward the vast arena. You might not like the answer. A ripple of faint laughter moved through some sections of the Velari audience, but the Queen did not smile. Her gaze never left him. Truth rarely asks permission to be comfortable, she replied. Proceed. Ethan lowered his eyes toward the armored plates across his chest. The locking mechanisms were standard Terran military issue, designed so that a single soldier could disengage them even with limited power remaining. His suit battery indicator flickered again. 18%. Plenty for one last dramatic moment, he thought. He raised both armored hands slowly so that the Velari guards lining the arena would not mistake the motion for aggression. The metal fingers moved to the central clasp at the front of his chest plate. The mechanism was scratched from months of use. A small red indicator light blinked faintly beside it. Ethan paused there for just a second. Thousands of alien eyes watched every movement. Somewhere above them, a hovering camera drone shifted position to capture a clearer angle. Queen Lysara leaned forward ever so slightly. Curiosity had replaced every trace of royal distance in her expression now. What secret? She asked quietly. Could a human possibly hide beneath such fragile construction? Ethan's gloved thumb pressed firmly against the release latch. The mechanism gave a soft mechanical click that echoed strangely in the quiet arena. The sound was small, but the reaction it created was enormous. Every voice in the chamber fell silent again. Ethan spoke one final sentence before the armor began to open. That is exactly the point, he said. We do not hide strength under our armor. The chest plate seals released with a slow hiss of equalizing pressure as the first section of the suit began to unlock. The first section of the chest plate slid forward with a quiet mechanical sigh, releasing a thin stream of cool vapor that curled into the arena air before fading beneath the bright lights. The sound was soft, but in the enormous chamber it felt louder than a thunderclap. Ethan Cole reached up slowly and grasped the edge of the armor panel. The metal was warm from hours of use, the familiar weight of it resting in his hands for the first time since the Velari had taken him into custody. He pulled the plate free and lowered it carefully to the polished floor. The impact was heavy but controlled, a dull metallic thud that rolled across the silent arena. Thousands of Velari eyes followed the movement. Queen Lysara did not look at the armor on the ground. Her attention remained fixed on what had appeared beneath it. For the first time, the Velari court saw the human without the shell of technology that had concealed him. Beneath the armor there was no biological plating, no armored carapace, no reinforced skeletal ridges that marked most warrior species. There was simply a human torso covered by a thin gray undersuit that clung to Ethan's shoulders and chest. The material was lightweight insulation, standard Terran equipment designed to regulate body temperature in hostile environments. Through the fabric, the outline of muscle and bone was plainly visible. To Velari eyes, the structure looked almost delicate. Ethan's shoulders were narrow compared to the towering Velari guards surrounding him. His arms lacked the layered density common among engineered soldiers. Even his skin tone, pale beneath the arena lights, seemed fragile compared to the luminous turquoise skin of the Velari watching from the terraces. A quiet murmur spread through the chamber. Scholars leaned forward in their seats. Guards exchanged uncertain glances. Queen Lysara's expression changed in a way so subtle that only those closest to her could see it. Her eyes widened by the smallest fraction. She had expected hidden machinery. She had expected alien biology. She had expected some explanation that would resolve the contradiction described in the battle reports. What stood before her instead was a human body that looked exactly like the medical records suggested it should. Soft tissue, flexible joints, a rib cage designed for breathing rather than armor. Ethan unclipped the next section of the suit, removing the shoulder plates one at a time. Each piece joined the first on the arena floor with a quiet metallic sound. With every plate that came away, the murmurs grew louder. The Velari had spent centuries perfecting biological enhancements for their warriors. Their soldiers carried natural defensive layers grown through generations of genetic engineering. By comparison, the human frame seemed impossibly vulnerable. One of the Velari advisors standing behind the queen finally whispered a thought aloud, the translation field carrying his voice clearly through the chamber. There is nothing unusual about him. Ethan rolled his shoulders as the last of the upper armor came free. The motion was slow and deliberate, like someone stretching after a long journey. Fresh air touched his skin for the first time since his capture. It felt strangely cool against the undersuit. He looked up at the queen. That is the point, Ethan said quietly. Queen Lysara studied him carefully, her golden eyes moving across the lines of the human body with a level of focus normally reserved for rare astronomical discoveries. The arena remained silent for several seconds before she spoke again. Her voice, when it came, was no longer filled with simple curiosity. It carried something deeper now. Confusion. You defeated 200 Velari soldiers, she said slowly. With this body. Ethan nodded once. Yes, Your Majesty. The queen drew a slow breath as the realization began to take shape in her mind, because the truth unfolding before her was far more unsettling than any hidden weapon could have been. Queen Lysara did not answer immediately. The vast arena remained wrapped in a silence so complete that even the faint hum of the hovering lights seemed unusually loud. Her golden eyes stayed fixed on the human standing before her, studying every visible detail of a body that, by all known Velari biological standards, should not have survived the events described in the battlefield reports. Ethan Cole stood calmly beneath that scrutiny. Without the armored shell, the difference between him and the Velari guards surrounding the arena became even more obvious. They towered over him by nearly a foot, their turquoise skin glowing faintly beneath the lights, their physiques reinforced by generations of engineered adaptation designed for endurance and combat. Ethan, by contrast, looked almost ordinary. His shoulders rose and fell slowly with each breath. The thin gray undersuit revealed the natural structure of a human frame built for flexibility rather than defense. A faint pattern of old scars crossed his forearms and collarbone, subtle lines that hinted at past hardships but carried none of the biological armor Velari warriors possessed. The queen stepped forward one slow pace, closing the distance between them to less than 8 feet. The movement caused the guards to shift slightly, but she lifted one hand, and they immediately stilled. She circled Ethan once with measured steps, observing him the way a researcher might examine a newly discovered phenomenon. When she stopped in front of him again, her voice was quieter than before. Our species evolved for survival through strength, she said. Our soldiers are designed to endure extremes that most life forms cannot tolerate. Reinforced bones, dense muscle fiber, protective skin layers. Her gaze moved briefly across Ethan's uncovered arms. You possess none of these advantages. Ethan allowed a small breath of amusement to escape his nose. You are not wrong. A ripple of quiet reaction moved through the terraces again. Some Velari observers seemed confused. Others looked genuinely unsettled. The idea that a creature so physically vulnerable could accomplish what the reports described did not fit easily into their understanding of warfare or biology. Queen Lysara folded her arms slowly across her chest armor. Explain, she said. Ethan tilted his head slightly, as if considering where to begin. The arena lights reflected in his eyes now that the helmet was gone, revealing a steady calm that had not been present when he first entered the chamber. Humans are not built to win every fight, he said. We are built to keep going after we should have stopped. One of the Velari advisors spoke quietly behind the queen. That is not a biological trait. Ethan shrugged lightly. No, it is a choice. The words seemed to linger in the air. Queen Lysara studied him again, her mind clearly working through the implications. Velari culture had always valued preparation and calculated superiority. Their victories came from engineering, strategy, and controlled evolution. The concept that determination alone could influence survival sounded almost primitive. Yet the human standing before her was living evidence that something about his species operated under different rules. You expect me to believe, the queen said slowly, that a fragile organism defeated trained Velari warriors through determination. Ethan met her gaze directly. No, your majesty. He gestured lightly toward the discarded armor pieces resting on the arena floor behind him. I expect you to understand that the armor helped. A quiet wave of laughter moved through the Velari audience for the first time since the demonstration began. Even the queen allowed the corner of her mouth to move slightly, though the curiosity in her eyes remained far stronger than amusement. She took another slow breath and spoke again. If your species truly relies on something as unpredictable as personal choice, she said, then humans are either incredibly dangerous or incredibly admirable. Ethan considered that for a moment before answering. Sometimes both. For several seconds neither of them spoke. Then a faint electronic tone echoed somewhere high above the arena ceiling. It was subtle, but the sound instantly caught the attention of the Velari officers standing along the perimeter. There. Heads turned upward in perfect synchronization as the alert system repeated the signal, slightly louder this time. Queen Lysara's expression shifted immediately. The curiosity vanished, replaced by the sharp focus of a ruler accustomed to unexpected developments. She looked toward the upper command balcony as a Velari communications officer rushed to the edge of the platform, clearly struggling to process new information appearing across his display. The officer hesitated for a fraction of a second before speaking. Your Majesty, he announced carefully. Long-range sensors have detected an unidentified fleet entering high orbit above the capital. The quiet arena suddenly felt much larger. The quiet inside the arena shattered not with panic, but with the sudden shift of attention from curiosity to command. Queen Lysara turned sharply toward the upper balcony, where the communications officer stood frozen beside the glowing sensor console. The hovering lights above the arena flickered slightly as the palace systems redirected power toward orbital defense networks. Every Velari guard along the perimeter straightened at once, their disciplined movements echoing through the chamber like a synchronized breath. The murmurs that had filled the terraces seconds earlier vanished as thousands of Velari citizens watched their queen. Ethan Cole followed their gaze upward. Your Majesty. Their transponder signatures appear intentionally masked. Ethan exhaled slowly through his nose. That detail sounded familiar. Civilian fleets did not hide identification beacons unless they expected trouble. The Queen noticed the subtle change in his posture. Her golden eyes shifted briefly back toward the human standing in the center of the arena. You seem unsurprised, she observed. Ethan tilted his head slightly. I have seen similar arrivals before. Several Velari officers turned their attention toward him immediately. One of the advisors spoke in a low voice. You are implying hostile intent. Ethan lifted one shoulder in a small shrug. I am implying that fleets that hide their identity rarely arrive to deliver gifts. The translation field carried his words across the chamber, and the effect was immediate. The Velari audience did not panic, but the quiet tension thickened noticeably. Queen Lysara studied Ethan for a long moment, clearly weighing the unexpected perspective offered by someone who technically remained a prisoner. Finally, she turned back toward the command balcony. "Activate full orbital observation," she ordered. "Deploy defensive satellites, but maintain a non-aggressive posture until the fleet declares its intentions." The officer nodded quickly and began issuing commands through his console. Far above the palace, unseen by the crowd below, Velari defense platforms began adjusting their positions across the planet's upper atmosphere. Ethan glanced toward the discarded armor plates resting on the arena floor behind him. His suit battery still held some charge, though not much. He looked back at the Queen. "Your Majesty," he said calmly, "if that fleet is what I think it might be, waiting politely may not buy you much time." Queen Lasara turned to face him fully again. Her gaze was sharp now, not curious. "Explain." Ethan nodded toward the ceiling as if he could see the distant ships hovering beyond the clouds. "Some groups out there believe the fastest way to understand a new civilization is to see how quickly it can defend itself." The Queen's eyes narrowed slightly as the meaning settled in. Around them the arena remained silent, but the atmosphere had shifted completely. What had begun as a demonstration about human biology was now becoming something far larger. Queen Lasara spoke quietly. "And you believe this fleet intends to test us?" Ethan met her gaze without hesitation. "I believe they already have." Somewhere far above the palace walls another alert tone sounded, louder this time, echoing through the arena like the distant signal of a storm approaching the horizon. The second alert tone echoed longer than the first, vibrating through the immense architecture of the Velari Palace like a warning carried by the walls themselves. In the terraces above the arena floor, the Velari citizens remained disciplined and silent, but the tension was now unmistakable. Their luminous skin reflected the shifting lights as the palace systems quietly transitioned from ceremonial mode to defensive readiness. Ethan Cole lifted his eyes toward the high ceiling where the faint glow of orbital telemetry flickered across the translucent panels overhead. Even from the arena floor, he could tell the palace was now receiving a continuous stream of sensor data from the defense satellites circling nearly 200 miles above the planet. Somewhere beyond those clouds an unknown fleet was watching the same world. Queen Lasara stood motionless for a moment as she listened to the incoming reports flowing through the command balcony. "React quickly at all." The Velari advisors exchanged quiet looks behind their ruler. The logic was uncomfortable but impossible to ignore. Velari civilization valued calculated responses. Yet a calculated response sometimes looked like hesitation to those who relied on intimidation. The communications officer suddenly stiffened as new data flashed across his display. "Your Majesty," he announced, his voice tighter now. "The unidentified fleet has acknowledged our broadcast." The entire arena seemed to lean forward collectively. "Audio transmission incoming." Queen Lasara lifted her chin slightly. "Projected." A low hum rolled across the chamber as the palace systems opened the channel. For several seconds nothing but static filled the air. Then a voice emerged from the speakers suspended above the arena. It was calm, measured, and unmistakably confident. "Velari Dominion," the unknown speaker said. "Your world has entered a region of contested expansion. We are conducting a routine evaluation of emerging civilizations." Ethan closed his eyes briefly and exhaled. He had heard that tone before. It was the voice of a species that believed it had already won every argument worth having. The transmission continued. "Your orbital defenses have been noted. Your technological level has been recorded. Remain calm while our observers complete their assessment." The channel went silent again. Across the arena, the Velari audience absorbed the message in complete stillness. Queen Lasara did not react immediately. She stood in place for several seconds before slowly turning her gaze back toward the human standing at the center of the arena floor. "An evaluation," she said quietly. Ethan nodded once. "Yes, Your Majesty." The Queen studied him with renewed focus. "And what happens when their evaluation is complete?" Ethan looked toward the high ceiling again, where the distant fleet waited beyond the atmosphere. "That depends," he said, "on what they think you are capable of doing next." For several seconds after the transmission ended, the arena remained silent except for the quiet hum of the palace systems adjusting to the new situation unfolding above the planet. Thousands of Velari citizens watched their queen, waiting for the next command, while the hovering lights overhead shifted into a cooler spectrum that reflected off the polished obsidian floor like distant starlight. Ethan Cole remained where he stood, bare of his armor except for the thin gray undersuit, his discarded chest plate and shoulder pieces lying behind him like fragments of a different moment that now felt far away. Queen Lysara's golden eyes stayed fixed on him, as if the human had suddenly become part of the problem she was solving. The voice from orbit had been calm, almost polite, but the meaning behind it had been unmistakable. "Tried to be polite," he said. "We assumed diplomacy would solve the misunderstanding." The Queen studied him carefully. "And the second time?" Ethan allowed the smallest hint of a smile to appear. "The second time we made sure the observers understood exactly how quickly humans could respond." Several Velari officers shifted slightly at that statement. The Queen remained completely still, but her eyes sharpened with new interest. "You are suggesting we demonstrate our capabilities." Ethan shrugged lightly. "I am suggesting that someone who calls your world an experiment probably expects you to behave like one." The arena lights flickered again as new telemetry flowed through the palace network. Above the planet, the unknown fleet continued its quiet observation. Queen Lysara looked toward the command balcony, then back at the human. For the first time since the transmission, the faintest trace of a smile touched her expression. "Then perhaps," she said calmly, "it would be wise to show them that Velari civilization is not a laboratory subject." Ethan nodded once in agreement as the distant drones continued watching from the sky. Queen Lysara remained still for several seconds after speaking, the faint smile on her lips fading back into the composed focus of a ruler accustomed to making decisions that shaped the fate of entire systems. Above the arena, the soft glow of telemetry continued to ripple across the translucent ceiling panels, each flicker representing new data arriving from satellites positioned nearly 200 miles above the planet's surface. The unknown fleet remained there, patient and silent, like a set of distant eyes waiting for a reaction. Ethan Cole shifted his weight slightly, rolling one shoulder where the armor had rested moments earlier. Without the suit, he could feel the cool, controlled air of the arena against the fabric of his undersuit, a reminder that he was no longer hidden behind technology. Across the chamber, the Velari citizens watched him with a different kind of curiosity now. Only minutes ago, he had been a prisoner whose biology was under question. Now he had become a voice offering perspective in the middle of a planetary test. Queen Lysara turned toward the command balcony again. "Status of the observation drones," she said calmly. The communications officer glanced at the sensor grid displayed across his console. "Multiple units have entered the upper atmosphere, Your Majesty. They are maintaining positions between 70 and 90 miles. Above the capital, their sensors appear focused on defensive infrastructure." Ethan nodded slightly to himself. "That means they want to see what wakes up first." The Queen looked back at him. "You believe they are measuring our response time?" "Yes," Ethan answered. "If your defenses activate slowly, they mark the planet as unprepared. If they activate quickly, they mark the planet as capable." One of the Velari strategists stepped forward from behind the throne platform. His voice carried the calm precision of someone trained in fleet logistics. "Our orbital defense grid has already powered to full readiness. Every satellite weapon and shield array is online." Ethan tilted his head slightly. "Then the observers have already learned something important." Queen Lysara studied him carefully. "Which is?" Ethan gestured upward with one hand. "They now know you are paying attention." The strategist considered that statement for a moment before nodding slowly. It was a simple observation, but it confirmed that the Velari Dominion had not been caught completely unaware. The Queen began pacing slowly across the arena floor, her boots making soft, measured sounds against the polished surface. Every movement carried the quiet gravity of a leader assembling a plan in real time. When she stopped again, she faced the terraces filled with her people. "Velari civilization does not respond to intimidation," she said, her voice projecting easily through the chamber. "Nor do we ignore visitors who arrive unannounced in our skies." Her gaze lifted toward the glowing ceiling panels as if she could see beyond them to the ships orbiting in the darkness of space. "If these observers wish to measure our readiness, then we will allow them to witness it clearly." Ethan watched her for a moment with open respect. Humans often responded to pressure with stubbornness, but the Velari Queen was demonstrating something equally powerful: calm control. The communications officer suddenly raised his head again as new data appeared on his display. Your Majesty, the unidentified fleet has begun repositioning several of their vessels. Their observation drones are adjusting altitude. Ethan crossed his arms thoughtfully. That means they noticed something. Queen Lysara turned toward him. What would cause them to change position? Ethan allowed a small smile. Usually that happens when the observers realize the subject of their test is about to do something interesting. The Queen held his gaze for a long moment before turning back toward the balcony. Prepare a transmission, she ordered. Open a channel to the fleet. The officer hesitated briefly. What message shall we send, Your Majesty? Queen Lysara's golden eyes reflected the shifting light of the arena as she answered calmly. Inform them that Velari civilization has completed its own evaluation of their arrival. Ethan glanced upward again toward the unseen ships in orbit. Whatever came next, the observers above the planet were about to learn that their experiment was no longer one-sided. The arena lights dimmed slightly as the palace communication systems redirected additional power toward the long-range transmission array that now extended from the upper towers of the Velari capital. High above the city, far beyond the thick cloud layers of the atmosphere, a narrow beam of encoded signal traveled nearly 200 miles upward toward the fleet waiting in orbit. Inside the arena, the Velari citizens watched their queen in absolute silence, sensing that the next few words spoken across that channel would shape the tone of everything that followed. Ethan Cole stood quietly near the center of the chamber, arms loosely crossed, his gray undersuit a stark contrast against the luminous turquoise tones of the Velari around him. The discarded armor pieces behind him had grown almost forgotten now, relics of a conversation that had already evolved into something much larger. Queen Lysara stepped toward the command balcony as the communications officer turned slightly to acknowledge her presence beside the console. The soft glow of the sensor displays reflected in her golden eyes, while streams of orbital telemetry continued scrolling across the curved screens. Channel is open, Your Majesty, the officer announced carefully. Transmission path locked onto the central vessel of the unidentified fleet. The Queen nodded once. She did not rush the moment. Instead, she allowed a brief pause, as though giving the distant observers a few seconds to recognize that the response they were about to receive would not resemble the quiet submission they might have expected from a civilization under inspection. Finally she spoke. Her voice carried through the palace transmitters and surged upward through the atmosphere toward the waiting ships above the planet. Unidentified fleet in Velari orbit, she said calmly. This is Queen Lysara of the Velari Dominion responding to your evaluation. The arena speakers echoed her words so that every citizen present could hear them clearly. High above the planet, the signal reached the observing vessels. For several seconds there was no reply. Ethan glanced upward again as if he could sense the attention of the distant fleet, focusing more sharply now. When the response finally arrived, the same calm voice from earlier returned through the speakers. Velari Dominion, the unknown representative said. Your response time has been recorded. Your defensive systems activated within acceptable parameters. Continue remaining calm while our analysis proceeds. Ethan exhaled quietly through his nose. That sentence told him everything he needed to know about the observer's attitude. Queen Lysara, however, did not allow the statement to stand unanswered. She lifted one hand slightly toward the communication officer, signaling that the channel would remain open. Your analysis appears incomplete, she said evenly. The voice from orbit paused for a moment before responding. Clarify. The Queen turned her head slightly toward the arena floor, where Ethan stood watching the exchange with quiet interest. For a moment their eyes met, and in that brief glance the human could see that she had already understood the deeper meaning behind the situation. The observers believed they were studying Velari civilization as if it were an isolated experiment. What they did not yet realize was that Velari space had already encountered another species capable of offering a different perspective. Queen Lysara returned her attention to the communication array. You have measured our response time, she continued, but you have not measured our alliances. The arena remained silent as the words echoed upward toward the fleet. Ethan raised one eyebrow slightly, realizing where the Queen was taking the conversation. The voice from orbit returned, this time carrying a faint trace of curiosity beneath its controlled tone. Velari Dominion diplomatic records show no active military alliances within this sector. Queen Lysara's gaze shifted once more toward the human standing below the royal platform. Your records, she replied calmly, are out of date. Ethan felt every Velari eye in the arena turn toward him at the same moment, as if the entire chamber had suddenly recognized that the quiet human in the gray undersuit had just become part of the message being sent into space. For a brief moment after Queen Lysara's statement, the arena fell into a silence so complete that even the distant hum of the palace power systems seemed unusually loud. Thousands of Velari citizens now stared toward the human standing beneath the royal platform, their luminous turquoise skin reflecting the pale glow of the arena lights, as if the entire chamber had suddenly shifted its focus onto a single unexpected variable. Ethan Cole remained where he stood, arms still loosely crossed, his posture calm despite the weight of attention pressing down from every direction. High above the capital, nearly 200 miles beyond the atmosphere, the unknown fleet received the Queen's declaration through the narrow beam of the planetary transmission array. Inside the arena speakers, the distant voice returned again, but this time the calm certainty it had carried earlier seemed slightly altered. Clarify your statement, the representative from orbit said. Queen Lysara did not rush to answer. She allowed the pause to stretch just long enough to ensure that the observers understood the shift in tone. Then she spoke again, her voice steady and unmistakably confident. Velari civilization is not isolated, she said. Your evaluation assumes that we stand alone within this region of space. Ethan lifted his eyes toward the ceiling again as though he could see the distant ships waiting beyond the clouds. He had heard this kind of exchange before. Interstellar powers often made their first mistake when they assumed a smaller civilization had no connections beyond its borders. The voice from orbit responded after a short delay. Our records indicate no confirmed military alliances within Velari territory. Queen Lysara turned slightly, her gaze settling on Ethan once more. Your records, she repeated calmly, do not account for recent developments. The entire arena seemed to lean into that statement. Velari officers exchanged quiet looks. The advisors near the throne platform shifted slightly as they realized that the Queen was now weaving the presence of the human directly into the diplomatic response being sent to orbit. Ethan noticed the movement as well. He lowered his arms and let them rest at his sides, standing a little straighter beneath the weight of attention. The voice from the fleet spoke again, the hint of curiosity now unmistakable. Specify the nature of this alliance. Queen Lysara took one step forward toward the center of the arena floor, closing the distance between herself and the human soldier. The height difference between them was still visible, yet the atmosphere in the chamber had subtly shifted. Ethan was no longer being viewed as a captured outsider. Now he stood as evidence of something that observers had not anticipated. The Queen's golden eyes reflected the pale light of the hovering fixtures as she answered the question directed from orbit. Your evaluation began with the assumption that Velari civilization was the only intelligent power present on this world, she said. That assumption is incorrect. The arena speakers carried her words upward through the communication beam. Several seconds passed before the response returned. Our sensors have detected only Velari biological signatures across the capital region. Ethan finally spoke then, his voice calm but clear enough for the translation field to carry through the chamber. Your sensors were probably focused on the wrong details. A faint ripple of surprise moved through the Velari audience at the sound of the human addressing the fleet directly. Queen Lysara did not interrupt him. Instead, she allowed the moment to unfold naturally. The voice from orbit responded after another pause. Identify yourself. Ethan lifted his gaze toward the ceiling and answered simply. Ethan Cole, Terran Recon Marine. The silence that followed lasted several seconds longer than any pause earlier in the exchange. Somewhere within the distant fleet, the observers were now searching their records again. When the voice returned through the arena speakers, the calm tone had changed just enough for the difference to be noticeable. Terran, origin unlisted in our regional charts. Ethan allowed a faint smile. That is because humans are very good at arriving where people do not expect us. Across the arena, Queen Lysara watched the reaction unfolding through the communication channel with quiet satisfaction. because the observers above the planet were beginning to understand that their evaluation had just become far more complicated than they had planned. The silence that followed Ethan Cole's introduction stretched across the arena like a held breath. Thousands of Velari eyes remained fixed on the human soldier standing beneath the royal platform, while the palace transmission array continued sending his words nearly 200 miles upward through the atmosphere. For the first time since the unidentified fleet had appeared above the planet, the response from orbit did not arrive immediately. Inside the arena, the delay was noticeable. Queen Lysara watched the glowing communication panel beside the balcony console with calm patience, but even she could sense that something had shifted among the distant observers. Ethan rested his hands loosely at his sides and glanced once more toward the translucent ceiling panels where faint sensor reflections moved like slow drifting stars. Somewhere beyond those clouds, analysts aboard the foreign vessels were searching their databases, comparing signals, recalculating assumptions. When the voice from orbit finally returned, it sounded more measured than before. Terran origin remains unregistered within our navigational archives, the representative said. Provide clarification regarding your presence within Velari territory. Ethan allowed a quiet breath of amusement. The question itself revealed the observer's confusion. For a civilization conducting evaluations across multiple star systems, encountering an unknown species was not supposed to happen. Humans explore, Ethan answered simply. Sometimes we arrive in places before the maps do. A faint murmur moved through the Velari terraces again as the translation field carried his response across the arena. Queen Lysara observed the human carefully. She had already realized something important about Ethan Cole during the last several minutes. He was not speaking with arrogance. He was speaking with the relaxed certainty of someone who had stood in similar situations before. The voice from orbit responded again after another short delay. Your species is not recognized as a member of any established galactic registry. Explain the technological origin that allows you to travel between systems. Ethan lifted one shoulder slightly in a casual shrug. Curiosity, he said. Several Velari officers exchanged puzzled glances at the simplicity of the answer. The Queen, however, seemed more interested than confused. Curiosity alone does not construct starships, she said quietly. Ethan nodded. That is true. But curiosity is what convinces a species to try building them. The communication channel remained open as the distant fleet processed the statement. Above the arena, the telemetry lights continued shifting across the ceiling panels as orbital defense satellites tracked the movements of the observing vessels. For a few seconds, no one spoke. Then the unknown representative addressed Queen Lysara directly. Velari Dominion, the voice said. Your civilization has introduced an undocumented interstellar species into this exchange. This development alters the parameters of our evaluation. The Queen stepped slightly forward so that her voice would carry clearly through the transmission. Then adjust your evaluation accordingly, she replied calmly. Ethan glanced sideways at her, recognizing the quiet confidence behind the response. Velari leadership was demonstrating something the observers had not anticipated. Composure under scrutiny. The voice from orbit paused again before answering. Clarify the nature of the Terran presence within your domain. Queen Lysara allowed a brief silence to pass before she answered. At the moment, she said, Terran presence within Velari territory appears to consist of one soldier standing in my arena. A faint ripple of restrained laughter moved through the Velari audience. Ethan smiled slightly at the accuracy of the description. The Queen continued. However, she added, her golden eyes lifting toward the ceiling once more, that single presence has already demonstrated something your fleet did not anticipate. The representative from orbit spoke again. Specify. Queen Lysara turned her head toward Ethan Cole, allowing the entire arena and the distant observers to follow the direction of her gaze. It has demonstrated, she said calmly, that Velari civilization is not the only species capable of adapting quickly to unexpected circumstances. Ethan met her glance with a quiet nod. Above the planet, the unidentified fleet remained in orbit, but the tone of the evaluation had clearly begun to change. The arena remained quiet after Queen Lysara's final statement, but the silence now carried a different kind of weight. It was no longer the silence of uncertainty. It was the silence of calculation. Nearly 200 miles above the planet, The unidentified fleet continued its silent orbit, yet the distant observers were clearly reconsidering the situation unfolding below them. Ethan Cole could almost imagine the analysts aboard those ships studying the sensor feeds, replaying the moment when the supposed subject of their evaluation had introduced an entirely unregistered species into the conversation. Humans had a habit of complicating neat plans. The voice from orbit finally returned, but the tone had shifted once again. The calm confidence that had framed the earlier messages was now tempered by something closer to professional caution. "Velari Dominion," the representative said slowly. "Our initial analysis categorized your civilization as regionally stable but strategically isolated." Queen Lysara listened without interrupting, her posture relaxed yet unmistakably attentive. The presence of Terran technology and personnel indicates that this classification may be incomplete. Ethan allowed the smallest hint of a smile. That was one way of admitting a mistake without saying the word. The Queen answered with the same calm composure she had maintained since the fleet's arrival. "Evaluations based on incomplete data often lead to inaccurate conclusions," she said. "Your fleet arrived expecting to observe a developing civilization. Instead, you discovered that the situation is more complex." The voice from orbit paused again, and for a moment only the quiet hum of the palace systems filled the arena. When the transmission resumed, the tone had changed yet again. "Terran Representative Ethan Cole," the voice said. "Confirm the operational status of your species within this sector." Thousands of Velari eyes turned toward the human again. Ethan took a slow breath and looked upward toward the ceiling panels glowing faintly with orbital telemetry. "Human presence in this sector is exploratory," he said clearly. "But humans have a habit of responding when our friends are being tested." The translation field carried the words across the arena, and a subtle ripple of approval moved through the Velari terraces. Queen Lysara glanced toward him briefly, the faintest sign of satisfaction in her expression. The voice from orbit responded after several seconds. "Your statement implies cooperative defense between Terran and Velari civilizations." Ethan shrugged slightly. "It implies that humans tend to show up when things get interesting." The pause that followed lasted longer than any earlier delay. High above the planet, the observers were no longer simply collecting data. They were reconsidering the entire purpose of their mission. Finally, the voice returned one last time. "Velari Dominion and Terran presence acknowledged. Evaluation parameters are being revised." Queen Lysara lifted her head slightly. "Revision accepted," she said calmly. Another moment of silence passed before the representative concluded. "Our fleet will withdraw to observation distance while further analysis is conducted." The transmission ended with a faint burst of static, and the palace speakers fell quiet. For several seconds, no one in the arena moved. Then the communications officer looked up from his console. "Your Majesty," he announced carefully, "the unidentified vessels are altering orbit. They are increasing distance from the capital by several hundred miles." A slow breath moved through the Velari audience as the tension that had filled the chamber began to ease. Queen Lysara turned her attention back toward Ethan Cole, studying him for a long moment. "To change things," he replied. "Sometimes we just show up at the right moment." High above the planet, the unknown fleet continued drifting farther into the darkness of space. Their evaluation of Velari civilization no longer quite as simple as it had been when they first arrived. The arena gradually returned to its natural rhythm after the transmission ended. Yet the atmosphere inside the Velari palace felt different than it had only minutes earlier. High above the planet, the unidentified fleet continued drifting farther away from the capital, their vessels now holding position several hundred miles beyond the previous observation orbit. Across the translucent ceiling panels, the telemetry lights slowly dimmed as the orbital defense network confirmed that the ships were no longer advancing. In the terraces surrounding the arena, the Velari citizens began to breathe again, their quiet murmurs returning like the gentle movement of wind through tall grass. What had begun as a demonstration about a single human soldier had turned into something far larger. Ethan Cole stood calmly at the center of the arena floor, still wearing the thin gray undersuit beneath the hovering lights. His armor remained where he had placed it earlier, the chest plate and shoulder pieces resting on the polished surface behind him like artifacts from a different chapter of the day. For a moment, he simply watched the faint glow above the ceiling panels, imagining the distant fleet retreating into deeper orbit. Queen Lysara stepped down from the royal platform and walked slowly across the arena floor toward him. The sound of her boots echoed softly in the enormous chamber, drawing the attention of every Velari present. When she stopped a few feet away, the height difference between them remained obvious, yet the tone between ruler and soldier had shifted completely. "It appears," she said thoughtfully, "that the observers have decided their evaluation is not yet complete." Ethan nodded once. That is how cautious civilizations handle surprises. The queen studied him for a long moment, her golden eyes reflecting the soft light above them. "Your Majesty, the unidentified fleet continues withdrawing to observation distance. Their drones are leaving the upper atmosphere." A quiet ripple of relief moved through the terraces, though Velari discipline kept the crowd composed. Queen Lysara inclined her head slightly in acknowledgement before returning her attention to the human standing before her. "When you arrived in my arena today," she said calmly, "you were a prisoner whose existence required explanation." Ethan folded his arms loosely again, listening. "Now," the queen continued, "you have become evidence of something far more important." Ethan raised one eyebrow slightly. "And what would that be?" The queen looked upward once more toward the fading glow of the orbital telemetry lights. "That the universe is larger than the assumptions of those who believe they already understand it." The arena remained quiet as her words settled across the chamber. Ethan followed her gaze toward the ceiling panels where the distant fleet had once been watching closely. Somewhere out there, analysts aboard foreign vessels were rewriting their reports about the Velari Dominion and the unexpected appearance of a human soldier standing calmly in a royal arena.